So Donald Trump delayed signing a finished trade agreement with Canada, and 34 days later, Ottawa signed a stronger one that didn't need the United States at all. The delay was supposed to buy Washington leverage for a better deal. Instead, according to officials briefed on the sequence, it gave Canadian negotiators exactly enough time to finalize an expanded protocol inside the 11 nation Pacific trade bloc, a bloc the United States isn't even a member of, worth $61 billion in new market access across Asia and the Pacific. Trade officials in at least three capitals now describe the postponement as the single costliest procedural decision of the year. The signing ceremony in Auckland lasted 8 minutes. Warren Buffett briefed on the outcome within hours, offered a line already being repeated in trade circles from Ottawa to Singapore. When you delay a deal to get better terms, Buffett said, you'd better make sure the other side doesn't already have somewhere better to be while they wait. When you hear what happened during those 34 days, the quiet ratification push nobody in Washington was tracking, the moment 10 other governments realized what Canada was bringing to the table, and the 8 minutes it took to sign a deal larger than the one still sitting unsigned in Washington. You'll understand why trade officials across the Pacific are calling this the clearest lesson in what a delay actually costs. Hit subscribe because what Ottawa just did in 34 days is rewriting how American allies respond when Washington stalls. Let me give you the full context because this delay didn't come out of nowhere. It was the product of months of negotiation between Washington and Ottawa over a revised bilateral trade agreement. Talks that had, by most accounts, reached substantial completion after nearly a year of back and forth over agricultural quotas, energy pricing, and digital trade provisions. According to two officials familiar with the final stretch of talks, the agreement was essentially finished, drafted, reviewed by legal teams on both sides, and scheduled for a formal signing. Then, days before the ceremony, the American side requested a postponement, citing a need for further review of specific provisions related to dairy market access, a category that had already been negotiated and agreed upon months earlier. Canadian officials, according to sources familiar with their reaction, were caught off guard less by the substance of the request than by its timing. A delay announced after the agreement had already been finalized and scheduled for signature, a sequence one senior Canadian trade official privately described as renegotiating after the negotiation was over. What almost nobody in Washington accounted for, according to two officials with direct knowledge of Canada's parallel diplomatic track, was that Canadian trade officials had spent the better part of 2 years working toward a deeper integration protocol within the comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the 11-nation trade bloc that includes Japan, Australia, Mexico, Vietnam, and several other Pacific economies, a bloc from which the United States had withdrawn years earlier and never rejoined. The protocol under negotiation would expand Canadian access to agricultural, automotive, and digital trade markets across all 11 member nations simultaneously, a scale of access no single bilateral agreement could easily replicate. Canadian negotiators had treated the protocol as a long-term structural priority, unrelated to any particular dispute with Washington, simply because deepening ties within a bloc the United States had already exited made sound strategic sense, regardless of how bilateral talks with America were proceeding. By the time the American postponement arrived, the protocol was, according to one Canadian official, close enough to finished that 34 days was a realistic window if everyone moved with real urgency. For the Canadian government, the tipping point wasn't the substance of the American delay. It was what officials described as the casualness of it. A request for further review delivered with no clear timeline for resolution and no acknowledgement that a signing ceremony had already been scheduled and communicated publicly. According to one senior official present in internal discussions, the mood in Ottawa shifted the moment it became clear the American side had no fixed date to offer in place of the one being canceled. An open-ended delay isn't a negotiating position. That official reportedly said, it's an indication that finishing this isn't actually a priority for them right now. So it doesn't have to be our priority either. That reasoning, according to two people present, is what shifted the Pacific Protocol from a long-term project to an immediate one. Most Americans also don't realize how differently the two governments treated the weeks surrounding the postponement. Canadian trade officials, according to internal ministry timelines reviewed by sources familiar with the process, had spent nearly 2 years building the Pacific Protocol methodically, holding regular quarterly check-ins with all 11 bloc members, regardless of how bilateral talks with Washington were progressing, treating the multilateral track as institutionally important on its own terms rather than as leverage against any particular dispute. American trade officials, by contrast, according to two people who worked adjacent to the bilateral process, spent the days immediately following the postponement, primarily managing internal messaging about why the delay was reasonable, rather than establishing any concrete plan for when talks with Canada might actually resume. One side had spent 2 years building toward a moment. The other side spent 34 days managing a talking point. That asymmetry is what determined how this ultimately played out. Let me take you inside those 34 days because this is where the real story lives. And it did not unfold the way anyone in Washington expected. The moment the American postponement was announced, Canada's trade minister convened an emergency working session inside a conference room at the Lester B. Pearson building, a room dominated by a long table, a wall map showing Pacific shipping routes, and a bank of secure phone lines connecting directly to counterparts across 11 time zones. According to two aides present, the minister opened the session not with frustration, but with a single practical question. How close are we really to finishing the Pacific Protocol? The answer, delivered by a senior negotiator who had been quietly managing the talks for nearly 2 years, was more encouraging than anyone in the room expected, closer than most people realize. We could finish this in weeks if everyone treats it like a priority starting today. Aides described the minister nodding once, closing a folder that had until then contained the now postponed bilateral talking points and setting it aside unopened for the remainder of the 34 days. The first 10 days were consumed by an intense round of secure calls to counterparts in Tokyo, CRA, Mexico City, and Hanoi, confirming which sections of the nearly finished protocol could be locked in on an accelerated calendar. According to one Canadian official involved in the outreach, the response from most capitals was immediate and enthusiastic. Several officials noting privately that they had assumed the process would drag for months longer without any particular urgency behind it. A senior Japanese trade official, briefed on Canada's accelerated timeline, reportedly told a colleague, "If Ottawa wants to move fast, we should move fast with them. This benefits everyone at the table, not just Canada." That sentiment, echoed across several capitals, is what allowed a process most observers expected to take the better part of a year to compress into little more than a month. By day 15, according to two people familiar with the negotiations, the protocol had moved from a series of separate bilateral understandings between Canada and individual member nations into a single unified text ready for full multilateral review, with only a handful of technical provisions around digital data localization and automotive content thresholds still requiring resolution. Negotiating teams worked in staggered shifts across time zones, spanning nearly 18 hours of coverage a day. Ottawa's team handing off active discussions to counterparts in Wellington and Canberra as the workday moved westward. A rolling, nearly continuous negotiation that one participant described as the fastest multilateral text I've ever seen move, because for once, everyone actually wanted it to move. Physical copies of the evolving text piled up in secure rooms in 3 capitals simultaneously, cross-referenced nightly against legal review notes, a scale of coordinated effort that stood in stark contrast to the single vague sentence that had triggered the entire acceleration in Washington. One Ottawa staffer recalled the room smelling permanently of coffee by day 20, cups accumulating on a side counter that nobody had time to clear. The climactic moment came on day 31, when trade ministers from all 11 Pacific Bloc nations gathered in Auckland for what had originally been scheduled as a routine annual review session, found themselves instead finalizing the most substantial expansion of the bloc's terms since its founding. According to three officials present, the final agricultural annex, the last unresolved provision, was settled after nearly 9 hours of continuous negotiation. Delegates working through a catered lunch. Nobody touched the harbor visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. As the afternoon light shifted toward evening, the room fell into a long silence when New Zealand's trade minister, chairing the session, set down her pen and said simply, "That completes it." Canada's trade minister, according to one A present, allowed a full 5 seconds of silence before responding quietly, "Then we're finished." No applause, no immediate statement to the assembled press waiting outside, just 11 delegations quietly confirming one by one that the text was final, folders closing around the table almost in sequence, a small physical punctuation mark on 9 hours of work. 3 days later, on day 34, Canada's trade minister placed a call to the American trade representative who had announced the original postponement. The call, according to two people briefed on its contents, lasted 8 minutes, conducted from the same conference room where the entire accelerated effort had been coordinated from the start. The wall map of Pacific shipping routes still pinned up behind her. The minister did not reference the delayed bilateral agreement directly. She informed her counterpart calmly and without elaboration that Canada had signed an expanded Pacific Trade Protocol effective immediately covering agricultural, automotive, and digital trade access across 11 member economies, and that Canada remained willing to continue bilateral discussions with the United States whenever a firm date exists to resume them. According to the account given by one person on the call, a pause followed of several seconds before the American representative asked what the total value of the new protocol represented. The minister's reported answer was brief: $61 billion effective as of this morning. The call ended shortly after, 8 minutes total. No raised voices, no counter offer, just a quiet statement of fact that could no longer be negotiated away. The aftermath moved quickly, and it moved in sharply different directions depending on which capital you were watching. Inside the American Trade Office, officials scrambled overnight to understand the scope of an agreement most had not been tracking closely, having assumed, according to one official, that any Pacific Bloc expansion involving Canada would take considerably longer to materialize. Internal assessments circulated the following morning reportedly underestimated the protocol's scope before being revised upward within a day once the full $61 billion figure was confirmed against multiple independent sources. Public statements followed within a day. The American statement characterized the delayed bilateral talks as continuing constructively and made no direct reference to the Pacific announcement. The Canadian statement, 4 sentences long, noted that Canada had secured expanded market access, reflecting years of patient multilateral engagement, and offered no further elaboration to reporters pressing for comment on the timing. One statement avoided the subject entirely, choosing careful language designed to suggest business as usual. The other simply stated a fact and moved on, declining every follow-up with polite, uniform brevity. Markets responded within hours. The Canadian dollar strengthened against a basket of currencies as traders priced in the expanded Pacific access. Its steadiest multi-day gain in more than a year, and shares in Canadian agricultural and automotive parts, exporters climbed on the announcement, with analysts specifically noting the reduced tariff exposure across 11 markets simultaneously. American agricultural exporters competing for similar Pacific market share saw modest declines as analysts flagged the reduced competitive advantage relative to Canadian producers now operating under the expanded protocol. According to one senior American trade official speaking anonymously, the internal review into how the postponement was handled began within days, with one memo reportedly describing the decision to delay as a pause that cost more than any concession we were trying to extract would have been worth. Overnight social media commentary followed a familiar pattern. One figure posting at 11:52 p.m. dismissing the Pacific Protocol is not a real deal, followed by a second post at 2:33 and insisting the bilateral agreement with Canada would still happen on our terms soon. followed by a third post near dawn, blaming unnamed staff for mishandling the original postponement. Timestamps that taken together suggested less confidence than the words themselves conveyed. By the following morning, according to one staffer, senior communications officials were quietly discouraging further commentary on the subject. Guidance that sources say was only partially observed. The dueling accounts that followed told the rest of the story without either side needing to editorialize. American officials described the Pacific Protocol's timing as coincidental, unrelated to the stalled bilateral talks. Canadian officials, when pressed directly on the sequencing, declined to confirm or deny any connection, offering only the same measured statement already issued. Nations do not typically decline to clarify a convenient coincidence when doing so would help their own narrative. The silence itself, several trade journalists noted at the time, did more explanatory work than any statement could have managed. Warren Buffett, who has spent more than 6 decades studying the true cost of delay in negotiations, offered the analysis that has become the defining framework for understanding this episode. He began by translating the diplomatic maneuvering into plain economic terms. A delay only costs you nothing if the other side has nothing better to do while they wait, Buffett said. The moment Canada had a nearly finished multilateral protocol to accelerate, 34 days stopped being a pause and became a deadline nobody in Washington realized they'd created. He paused, according to people who watched the segment live, before adding a further observation that is circulated nearly as widely as the verdict that followed it. I've sat on boards where a deal got postponed for further review, and everyone assumed the other party would simply wait. Sometimes they do, but the ones worth worrying about are the ones who quietly had a second option the whole time and just needed a reason to pursue it. He drew on decades of watching counterparties misjudge the cost of stalling. In 65 years of doing business, Buffett said, I have never once seen a delay improve a negotiating position when the other side had a productive way to spend the time. Delay only works as a tactic against someone with nothing else to build. Canada had something else to build and had been building it for 2 years, he continued, drawing a comparison from his own decades in business. I've watched companies postpone a merger for further review and lose the target to a competitor who simply moved faster during the pause. It happens more often than people think because the side doing the delaying almost never asks the right question, which is, what is the other side capable of finishing while I sit here reviewing? From there, he extracted the principle now circulating widely across trade circles. Every day you delay a deal is a day the other side gets to decide whether waiting for you is actually their best option. Sometimes they discover it isn't, and by the time you notice, they've already signed something else. And then came the verdict line delivered with his usual clinical flatness. You don't get to pause a negotiation and assume the other side simply waits patiently by the phone. Ottawa had somewhere else to be, and 34 days was exactly enough time to get there. The pause after that line, according to people who watched the broadcast, ran long enough that the anchor let the silence sit before moving to the next segment. An unusual choice several media observers noted as evidence of just how completely the line had landed. The consequences of those 34 days are cascading well beyond a single trade dispute, and they will outlast this news cycle by years. Economically, the $61 billion Pacific Protocol is not contingent on the delayed bilateral agreement eventually being signed. Sources inside Canada's trade ministry describe the two tracks as entirely independent, meaning Canadian exporters now have locked-in access across 11 Pacific economies, regardless of whatever happens with Washington. Agricultural cooperatives in Manitoba and Alberta are already fielding inquiries from Vietnamese and Malaysian buyers eager to lock in long-term supply agreements under the newly expanded quotas. Politically, the fallout inside Washington has been considerable, with lawmakers questioning why a routine request for further review was allowed to drift without a firm timeline, creating exactly the kind of opening that allowed Ottawa to finalize a larger alternative. At least one congressional committee has requested a briefing on how the postponement decision was made and whether any internal analysis considered how close Canada's parallel Pacific track actually was to completion. Career trade staff, according to two officials, had reportedly flagged the Pacific Protocol's advanced state in briefing memos submitted before the postponement was announced. Warnings that appear to have gone unheeded in the rush to request additional review time. On the defense and security side, officials familiar with discussions inside Allied circles describe quiet unease at how easily a procedural delay on the trade side translated into a demonstrable pivot, raising questions about how much other cooperation assumed to be stable actually rests on continuous active maintenance rather than default loyalty. One retired diplomat asked to characterize the reaction inside Allied foreign ministries described it as a reminder that goodwill isn't a renewable resource you can tap indefinitely without occasionally reinvesting in it. Internationally, the signal has reached well beyond the immediate parties. Other Pacific Bloc members have taken note of how quickly the protocol moved once real urgency existed, and at least two other prospective member economies have reportedly inquired about accelerated accession terms of their own. Mexico, already a bloc member, has publicly highlighted the episode as evidence of the bloc's growing relevance, precisely because it does not depend on American participation. The United Kingdom, which joined the bloc after the American withdrawal years earlier, has reportedly cited the episode internally as validation of its own decision to deepen Pacific ties rather than rely solely on transatlantic arrangements. And in Beijing, state commentary has framed the delay and its consequences as further proof that American economic centrality is eroding among its own allies, a strategic opening handed to competitors not through any adversarial action, but through a single unscheduled postponement. Each of these consequences compounds the others. Every dollar of expanded Pacific access reduces the relative importance of the still unsigned bilateral deal. Every allied nation watching Ottawa's response considers its own contingency options more seriously, and every additional delay by Washington on any front makes the next ally's pivot faster and less remarkable than the one before it. The situation is not simply a single missed signing ceremony. It is a structural demonstration that a bloc built specifically to function without American involvement grows more relevant, not less, every time Washington hesitates on its own separate commitments. The devastating irony sitting beneath all of it is this: the delay was requested specifically to secure better terms for the United States. Instead, within 34 days, it produced a scenario where Canada no longer needed the delayed deal nearly as urgently, having locked in $61 billion in alternative access to a bloc the United States isn't even part of. The pause meant to extract leverage instead demonstrated to 11 other nations watching closely exactly how little leverage the delay actually carried. What happened over those 34 days will be studied for years, not simply because of the $61 billion figure, though that number will anchor every retrospective account, and not simply because of the 8-minute call that confirmed it, though that detail will be repeated in every telling of how this ended, but because it is a case study and what a delay actually costs when the other side has somewhere productive to spend the time. Trump delayed a deal to get better terms. Ottawa used those 34 days to prove it no longer needed the deal on the same terms at all. Delays are built on an assumption, quiet and rarely examined, that the party waiting has nothing better to do than wait. The moment that assumption is wrong, the delay stops being a negotiating tactic and becomes evidence of how little the party requesting it understood about the counterparty's other options. There is a version of this story where Ottawa responded to the postponement with public frustration, a competing statement, an escalation designed to pressure Washington back to the table. That is not the version that happened. Canadian officials responded with a single practical question about how close an alternative already was, and then spent 34 days answering it. People will forget the specific dairy provisions that triggered the original delay, They will forget the precise digital trade language finalized in Auckland after 9 hours at the table. They will not forget that 34 days of delay produced a $61 billion agreement signed in 8 minutes with a bloc of nations Washington isn't even part of. That is the detail that will outlive every other detail in this story because it reframes everything else. Patience quietly outlasting stalling, preparation quietly outlasting procedure. Keep an eye on what happens next because the bilateral talks with Washington remain unsigned, with no new date announced. The Pacific Protocol is already generating fresh interest from other prospective members watching how quickly it came together. And every ally now observing this outcome understands precisely what a delay is worth when the other side isn't simply waiting by the phone. 34 days answered that question for Washington once. The next ally asking it may not need nearly that long to find out. Music, 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 M is at Mefort. Music, M is at Mefort. Singing music, Mefort. Singing music is super music. Music, music, most of music, the singing most music, come on. Music, singing, come on. Music, singing music, the Mford is Mfort. Music, 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 start to go home. Music for go home. Music, music, singing, music, Mumford music. Singing is a has been singing music, music lost on the D, singing, music, 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 raising, singing, singing, music, singing, singing, music, singing, Mumford music, music is lost on the Don. She music is lost on the Sh. Music, music, I, music say grandma, I say grandma, music, music, come on, Mefort and music.